Hey guys, it's Baban and I'm back with another tutorial, and I wanted to redo my old line art tutorial because I think it's a little bit out of date and we could do something a bit better. So I've got some lines here and this is what the finished thing looks like. So I want to go through what I have here and show you what I do with the lines and why. This tutorial was also released early on the Patreon, which you can find a link to in the description. Okay, so if we take the color layers off, what I have on all of these red layers here are my lines, and if I go through them in the layers, I've made sure to split them up for the process of this, so it's a bit easier to see. Got something a bit more weighty there, and then on these three are pretty much my baselines for what I'm drawing. So everything in these three is the first pass of what I'm drawing. Now you could do all these other bits of ink on the same layer. I like to split them up sometimes depending on if I'm unsure of how much I'm going to change it or what I want the finish to be like at the end. But specifically for this tutorial, I've managed to split these up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is make a new folder. I'm going to put these three layers for my basic lines in. I'm going to reduce that, and we're going to treat this like a sketch and go and do the lines on the top so that you can get an example of what this would be like as I'm putting my inks on. So the first thing I want to mention is I like to use the default G pen in Clip Studio, which looks like this. And if you look in the menu here for the pen tool, you can see something called Stabilisation that gives us a slider like this. If I leave it on 0 and I start to draw, if I draw quite fast, you can see the lines aren't very smooth, but it keeps up with where that cursor is. There isn't really any lag. If I move it up to 100, you can see it doesn't quite keep up with where that cursor is. There's quite a bit of lag there, but those lines are a lot smoother. So as I'm going with my inking, I will usually move it and hover it around sort of maybe around 30 to 100, depending on how smooth those lines need to be. I generally leave it on 0 for sketching. If I am more zoomed out, I will tend to leave it higher as well, which is the second thing I want to mention. As you see my canvas on the screen, I have a pen tablet, which is basically a screen that I draw onto physically with the pen. So if I zoom in, the image gets bigger, and the space that it physically takes up for me to draw a line onto the screen is greater. So if I was to zoom in and draw along the line for the leg here, then this area is a greater amount for me to draw across than it is if I zoom out and I were to draw it from here. So depending on how zoomed in I am, the physical distance that my arm has to move across the canvas to draw that line is either greater or smaller, and that can affect how your lines look. So I'm gonna reduce my stabilization a little bit. I tend to have it kind of around maybe 20 or 30 is comfortable. And if I zoom out and I try and draw that line, and then I also try and draw this line down here and around there and try and behave as though I am lining this from a sketch like so. If I do that, it's a very small movement, so all that I'm moving is my wrist. If I zoom in on what I've done, you can see that where these lines join up, because we've been zoomed out, it's not going to be quite as tidy, and it's probably not going to be quite as close to the sketch as you want it to be either, which, now that I've zoomed in, I would want to go and clean up, which obviously takes more work to go over it again and fix it, because I'd have to come back in and start noodling all these little corners out. But if I get rid of this and I zoom in more and we try again, it's not so bad because I've got my stabilizer on. It might take me a couple goes to get it exactly where I want it, but I'm able to line things up a little bit better. And because this is taking up more physical space on the screen that I'm having to move my arm across, I'm having to move more from my elbow and my shoulder than I am from my wrist. And it takes a little bit more to control that. And if you can train yourself to do that, it does hurt for a while in the muscles because you're learning to build them up and use them to be able to do this. But that will help to make your lines a lot more tidy. So for example, if I was wanting to line sort of this curve between here and here along this way, what I would try and do is make this cover as much of the screen space as I can. So if we just zoom in a little bit more, and then I would try my best to keep it as big as I could on the screen and just take it quite carefully like that to get my line down. I'll also try along the top here. If I up my stabilization a bit, it might be a little bit easier too. Along there, and you can see that's quite a smooth line. I haven't managed to line it up exactly. It might take you a couple of goes to do this. I'll usually undo my lines and redo them a lot. But to be able to do that and focus on, you almost have to lock your forearm area to keep your hand steady and move your shoulder. And you don't want to be resting and keeping your forearm still on the tablet too much. You want to be able to make these nice, big, flowy lines instead of having something so zoomed out like this that when you draw it and you think you're lining things up well, you zoom back in and then you end up with these little kind of inconsistencies where things don't quite line up. And it just makes a little bit more work for you. So that's how I will go about that lining now. Like I say, you kind of need to train the muscles in your arm to be able to do this. And also your brain to sort of do it consistently, because it's very easy to lapse back into just wanting to use your wrist to draw. Over time, that will also help if you tend to have a problem with maybe gripping the pen a little bit too hard, which can lead to kind of hand pain and carpal tunnel and that kind of thing, which you don't want. Another reason that I like to split up my layers like this so that we have the heavier things added on later is because a common mistake that I see is that people will follow this last piece of advice that I mentioned and they will zoom in, and obviously we've got a little bit more space on the screen at this point, and they will go and draw these larger lines in like so. And because it's a longer line and they're trying to get it down in one stroke, usually they will end up putting a little bit more weight onto the line, or the brush size that they use will be a little bit bigger like this. And then when we zoom in and draw something like the face, then it'll be like, oh, well, this brush size that I've been using, this is a little bit too big. Let me reduce it and start to ink the face like this. So when we zoom out, you can see the difference. If I just drag these lines over here, you can see the difference in the line weight between these. And when this is over an entire piece, it tends to look a little bit out of place because it's more so out of habit of wanting to be able to see that line when you're more zoomed out and kind of trying to compensate for that by making the brush size bigger. So what I will do to counteract that is on this first pass, I will try and keep my brush size the same. So whatever brush size I use on something that is a little bit more of a longer line over here, like this, is the same brush size that I will use on the face. And when I zoom in, they should be pretty consistent. That one's going to be a little bit more weighty anyway because we got some shadow underneath it. But if you keep the same brush size across the entire thing, and you should still have that little bit of weight that you can add with your pen pressure, everything should even out by the end, and you won't end up with something that is as big of a difference as what I just showed. I went over this again just to give a little bit of a better example of that. So to show the inconsistency of this, this is my first pass, how I would do it with the kind of line weight that I'll be explaining a little bit later on in this tutorial. And then is the general kind of issue that I will see. So anyway, with these larger lines, where you can tell where I've used the larger brush size, so anything sort of around here and the arms, everything around there is obviously a larger brush size that I've used. And then as I've zoomed in to do the faces, I've reduced the brush size, and when I zoom in, maybe it doesn't look too bad. And as I'm focused on it and working on it at this zoomed in level with a smaller brush, it will look fine. But then when we zoom back out, we start to see that inconsistency. It's very easy to get into the weeds, especially with faces and hair, because there can be so much detail in them. And that's why I think it's a little bit easier, if you're unsure, to try and separate your layers out and keep one consistent brush size, which is going to be very difficult at first. You're going to be mentally really fighting it, but it takes some time to get used to, in the same way that it takes time to get used to moving your arm correctly. And this makes it a lot easier, especially if you're starting out and that's something you do have difficulty with. And then as you go into these heavier lines, whether on a separate layer, it's easier to keep it separated, and that's also going to help you not run into that problem of adjusting the brush size constantly. This will also help you get your lines more accurate, because the smaller that your brush is, the more definite you have to be about where you're putting the line down. Okay, I'm going to make my lines a little bit darker so we can see them a bit stronger now. And you can see ever so slightly on this first pass of the lines that there's a little bit more weight in the lines sort of around here. It's a little bit more here, here, there. Anywhere there is more little creases and a bit more weight, and anything in the back is very, very skinny little lines like this, as opposed to sort of this kind of weight down here. And this is something that I expand on a little bit more when I get into my next layers that go on top like this. But generally what you want to do when you're going to do something where it is more focused on the lines and you want them to be quite visible, you're going to want more weight to be around anything that's coming further forward like this. So I would start to ink a little bit more heavily around here, just to add some more focus. And then anywhere where we're going to have sort of a little crease or crevice between two planes like this. And this is something that I've talked about in my rendering tutorial, which is on Patreon, and also in my value video, which I will put a link to now. But any of these areas with these heavy creases is taking the place of what would be an occlusion shadow if we were going to be rendering it. So how I would explain this in my value tutorial is that wherever we have a crease like this, where two planes come together, we're going to end up with light hitting these planes across here, and then we're going to have an area in the middle where none of that light is going to hit, and we're going to end up with a shadow. So essentially what we are doing is adding our lines here, which will be a little bit skinnier, and over here, and then we're filling in this area where that occlusion shadow would be, and that is what gives us our heavier lines. You could also think about this as if you were wireframing something. So if I was to go and put a wireframe onto these pants, you would get this roll around here of this shape, and then you would get something similar coming in here, and then you would start to see where we get little creases in, like the shape that I just drew, and also over here as we roll into those creases. And because we've got the light coming from above in this piece, when I put the shading in later on, we're also going to have where things round out along here and downwards into the shadow. So everything along here and along here. So we've got a bit more of a crease there around the butt actually, which goes into that kind of crevice shape again. So you can see when I take that off why my placement for where those lines are heavier is where it is. And if I bring in the rest of my line weight, you can see how that applies also onto things like the face, where we've got more heavy shadows around some of the eyes and where we have round creases like this above the eyelid here, and then as it comes out onto the eyelid there. So again, we have that sort of V shape where things are going to go a little bit more heavily into occlusion shadows. If I take my sketch layer off again and then bring the heavier one back onto the face, you can also see that in there as well, where I've played it up a little bit more, especially in the shadows under the eyes, because like I say, we've also got that heavier shadow or the heavier lighting coming from above that's going to give us more of a shadow cast downwards too. And then if we zoom out, you can see where it's a little bit more subtle here, and then by comparison, also the heavier. So we have a lot of that in clothing creases, like kind of around here, down here on the leg, a little bit on the shoes at the back, around here, and then also just that weight of wanting to bring things a little bit more forward like this. I want to show you some other examples that I have as well. So if we are to look at this, this is something a little bit more rendered that isn't colored in the same way as the last piece. And this is something that I actually ended up taking the lines off in the end, so I can remove my line layers. And this is something that is kind of finish rendered. And if I make a new layer, you can see I have those little occlusion shadows in these creases that I was mentioning. So any of that is handled in the actual painting itself with its own shading. So if I turn all of my rendering off, you can see the lines here, and I've done a little bit of that in this corner. You can see some of that occlusion shadow, but there really isn't too much because I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that on this, so I don't have the same variation in the line weight on here. That's just out of habit of me doing that, but I did end up removing the lines on this because I didn't really feel the need for the occlusion shadows to be handled by the lines in this. Likewise, another piece that I've got a time-lapse of that I posted, if I add the lines on and take this off, you can see I've naturally done a little bit of those occlusion shadows. You can see where I've added those into any corners, kind of undersides of hair shapes, and to define heavier edges of the focus around the face. And any area where there's a little bit more weight around the legs and the chest, and also a very obvious little bit of occlusion shadow here around this squish and in the squish around the knee. You can also see how anything that is less heavy and more flowy around the fins and the waves of them, where it would be very, very thin, sort of skin-like texture material. It's skinnier. We also don't have completed perfect lines. There are breaks in the lines, which will help soften them up as well. So I'm trying to reflect the weight of what I'm drawing and the focus in how heavy those lines are. And this was something that became redundant later, and I did not keep the lines as part of this because you can see I have added my own occlusion shadows as part of the rendering in this piece. So you can see that. For example, here in the crease by the elbow, you can see under the chin along this line. That is replacing what I would normally put in with line art if that was something that I wanted to be present in this. And if we go back to this piece, you can see that in any of those creases that I've got. Placement of inks can also be dependent on the light source too. So for example, on more comic book styles, you would have something more heavy. So maybe this would get completely blocked in along here. More like taking the place of a cast shadow. Down here, if we've got the light coming downwards from above, we would have this filled in. You could fill in a little bit more around here, more weight along there in the bottom of the hand. You could maybe even kind of block in knuckles like this and around the fingers a bit more as they are casting some more light or more shadow downwards from where the light is higher up. And then also more heavily around areas like this where we have those creases. So with the heavier inks, it would almost become like replacing the shadow value rather than just the occlusion shadows in those creases. But I don't tend to ink this heavily myself, but there are a lot of people that do. If I get rid of what we've done there as well and zoom in a little bit more, we've got what I mentioned on the previous piece. You can see where the lines are a little bit more thin up here. I don't have any of that line break, really, a tiny little bit by here, but not very much. I like to keep my lines quite consistent all the way around so they're easier to select later on. You can see specifically around the faces and the kind of small indications of occlusion shadows around here that I have more definition of the weight like so. It can be quite difficult to control the pen pressure on the line weight too as you draw it, but as you do more, you will get used to it. It can be difficult to get a hang of, especially when you're trying to control which part of your arm you're using to draw the lines and the pressure you're applying at the same time. So it can be very useful at first to split things up in the way that I have, where we've got this one layer and then we apply what I mentioned just now, give it a bit more weight. And occlusion shadows, I suppose I do have a little bit of cast shadows, for example, like around here where it's really quite heavy under here and under there, a little bit under Cac's hair this way, because then that will make it a little bit easier for you to control it and edit it and erase if there's something that you're not quite liking the look of. And if I reduce the base underneath, you can see where it is that I am putting more of that weight onto to make it more heavy. There is a little bit more of that kind of cast shadow, especially under the hat and down here, where it gets a little bit more blocky and heavy on the shadows because the light is going to be coming from above. Then if we up that again and add this on, I also decided to add a little bit of this hatching, so that's sort of me bringing in that shadow, but not as heavy as in the previous overdrawing example that I just showed you. This is more trying to bring it in as a gradient, but keep it inky. So I wanted to maintain that sharp hatched edge. Did you lay this egg, Caculine? The sharp hatched edge on the inks. If I reduce this again, you can see there aren't too many areas that I've added that hatching in. It's simply because I didn't want to have it merged with this layer with my heavier inks in case I wanted to adjust it. So that is also on its separate layer, but again, you could kind of merge these or have these in the initial layer that you do. Bring these lines back up. If I go and zoom in on the eyes, actually, you can see there is quite a lot of that more heavy shadow that I've added in. So around here, because we have heavy shadows anyway, in the hair, I like to kind of block out this crease that we've got in here to block the shadow in. I could probably pull more in around here if I really wanted to and play that up a lot more I didn't want to get too heavy on it. I probably could have pulled more in along here if I wanted to and really hammed up the shadows along there, but I wanted to leave a little bit more room for the rest of the colors that I added in later on. And then once I got these cell shaded colors on, I decided it looked like it wasn't quite showing up as I wanted it to. So I went around with another set of lines, which I do occasionally to highlight edges. And because this is less rendered, though I maybe would do this with rendering as well, to show layers a little bit more, to break up that overlapping, because the pose is so busy and tucked in together, there isn't much of a silhouette to speak of with this. I have a little bit of fading out, but the main focus of that is this other layer of the white edge, which also blends in to the background, and I erased from the whole piece later so that we could swap the colors out of it so the background color could also bleed in to where this is. If I reduce this white layer that I have as well, you can see my main objective with this was to highlight edges. So I needed to split the shoulder here from anything behind. I wanted to split the hand a little bit here and here so that we would have a lighter value in the middle against any of those dark lines and any of the coloring that was behind them, because a lot of the colors in this are quite dark, as in the local colors are quite dark, and more of that brightness is coming in the shading, but there's a lot of things that could be split up from the back like so. But I'm also trying to bring in that line weight in there just to pull things forward. So especially around the hand at the front, we've got that, and then it kind of fades out as it goes further down into where the shadows are. So I'm almost treating this in a reverse way to where I'm putting my shadows on earlier, and trying to increase the weight where things are a little bit more weighty or there are my occlusion shadows, to doing this in place of where the light's hitting, but also giving it that weight and indicating where that focus wants to be. So if I zoom out, we bring this back up to 100. That is also helped out by the gradients that I've put in around where those are as well, but that's more in towards sort of colouring and values, and less to do with the line art. But I would consider this white that I've added in to split things up part of the line art as well. I also tried to not get that to interfere with where I had any of that dark line art too. It's more to separate that and any dark colours that we have. Yeah, I hope this helped. If it did, give us a like, share if you think it'll help someone else, and subscribe for new videos when I have them. I am posting new tutorials on the Patreon every month. This one was released early there. There is also a bunch of exclusive tutorials on there for different art stuff. I also post art there early now too. Yeah, thanks for watching. Goodbye!